Sarah Martinez never expected her Tuesday evening jog through downtown Phoenix to turn into a nightmare. The 32-year-old veteran had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger, leading special operations missions that most people could never imagine. Now, 2 years after returning home, she worked as a fitness instructor at a local gym while attending college on the GI Bill. The sun was setting behind the desert mountains as Sarah rounded the corner onto 5th Street. Her running shoes hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, and her breathing remained controlled despite the Arizona heat. She wore simple black running shorts and a gray tank top, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested her military background or the extensive combat training that had shaped her into one of the Army's elite soldiers. 3 men stood near the entrance of a dimly lit bar called Murphy's Tavern. They appeared to be in their 20s, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in this working-class neighborhood. The tallest one, wearing a designer polo shirt, held a beer bottle and was talking loudly to his companions. His voice carried an arrogant tone that made Sarah unconsciously assess her surroundings, a habit she had developed during her military service. As Sarah approached, she noticed a young woman standing near the 3 men. The woman looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot and glancing around as if searching for an escape route. She appeared to be college-aged, wearing a simple dress and carrying a small purse. Her body language screamed distress, though she was trying to remain polite. Sarah slowed her pace, her instincts telling her something was wrong. The tallest man moved closer to the young woman, blocking her path to the street. His friends flanked him, creating a barrier that prevented her from leaving. The woman took a step backward but found herself pressed against the brick wall of the building. The man in the polo shirt reached out and grabbed the woman's arm, saying something that made her shake her head vigorously. Sarah could see tears forming in the young woman's eyes. The situation was escalating quickly, and there were no other people on this particular stretch of street. The few cars that passed by were moving too fast for their occupants to notice what was happening. Sarah made a decision that would change her evening completely. She stopped running and walked directly toward the group. Every fiber of her being told her to intervene, just as she had been trained to protect innocent people during her military service. She had no way of knowing that these 3 men had connections to organized crime in the city, or that they were accustomed to getting whatever they wanted through intimidation and violence. The young woman's name was Jessica Chen, a 19-year-old college student who had made the mistake of walking alone to meet friends at a nearby restaurant. The 3 men had approached her under the pretense of asking for directions, but quickly surrounded her when she tried to leave. They were not the type of people who accepted rejection easily, and they had already decided that Jessica would be coming with them whether she wanted to or not. Sarah cleared her throat as she approached the group. The 3 men turned to look at her, their expressions showing annoyance at the interruption. The leader, whose name was Marcus Webb, was the son of a wealthy businessman who had always used his family's money and influence to avoid consequences for his actions. His 2 companions, Tony and Derek, were equally privileged and equally accustomed to intimidating anyone who stood in their way. The confrontation that was about to unfold would test every skill Sarah had learned. During her years of military training, she had faced enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, but she had never imagined she would need to use those same skills on the streets of her own hometown. The 3 men had no idea they were about to pick a fight with someone who had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than anything they could imagine. Sarah approached the group with calm confidence, her voice steady and clear. "Excuse me, is everything okay here?" she asked, making direct eye contact with Jessica, who looked relieved to see another person. Sarah's training had taught her to assess threats quickly, and she could immediately tell that these men were used to intimidating people who couldn't fight back. Marcus Webb turned toward Sarah with a sneer, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of alcohol on his breath. "Mind your own business, lady. This doesn't concern you." He was tall and muscular from regular gym workouts, but Sarah could tell from his stance that he had never been in a real fight. His confidence came from his size and his wealth, not from any actual combat experience. Sarah remained calm, positioning herself so that she could see all 3 men while staying close enough to Jessica to protect her if necessary. "I think the young lady wants to leave," she said simply. "Why don't you let her go on her way?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations, though she kept her tone respectful. Tony, the shortest of the three men, laughed and took a step towards Sarah. "What are you going to do about it? Call the cops?" He pulled out his cell phone and waved it mockingly. "My dad's golf buddy is the police chief. Good luck with that." The three men had grown up in wealthy families that had always protected them from the consequences of their actions. Derek, the third member of the group, moved to Sarah's left side, attempting to surround her just as they had done with Jessica. "You should leave now before you get hurt," he said, cracking his knuckles in what he thought was an intimidating gesture. He had no idea that Sarah had been trained to handle multiple attackers in much more dangerous situations. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She quickly analyzed the positions of all three men, noting their body language and identifying the most likely threats. Marcus was the leader and probably the most aggressive. Tony was trying to flank her from the right while Derek was moving to her left. Behind them, Jessica pressed herself against the wall, too frightened to run. The situation reminded Sarah of a mission she had completed in Kandahar, where she and her team had to extract a kidnapped aid worker from a compound filled with armed militants. The principles were the same. Assess the threat, protect the innocent, and use only the force necessary to accomplish the mission. The main difference was that these men were drunk civilians rather than trained enemy fighters. Marcus finished his beer and threw the empty bottle onto the sidewalk, where it shattered into pieces. "Last chance, jogger girl. Walk away and pretend you never saw anything." His voice had taken on a more menacing tone, and Sarah could see that he was preparing to escalate the situation. She noticed a bulge in his jacket pocket that could have been a weapon. Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and her mind clear. She had learned long ago that showing fear or backing down from bullies only made them more aggressive. "I'm not going anywhere until the young lady is safe," she said quietly. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, but she was ready to react instantly if any of the men made a threatening move. The three men exchanged glances, communicating without words in the way that people who had been friends for years often did. They had decided that Sarah needed to be taught a lesson about interfering in their business. Marcus nodded slightly to his companions, and they began to move into positions that would allow them to attack her from multiple angles. What Marcus, Tony, and Derek didn't know was that Sarah had faced much more dangerous opponents during her military service. She had been trained by some of the best instructors in the world, and she had proven herself in combat situations where a single mistake could mean death. These three drunk college graduates were about to discover what it meant to pick a fight with someone who had dedicated years of her life to protecting innocent people from exactly this type of predator. The confrontation was about to escalate beyond anything the three men had experienced before. They were accustomed to people backing down when faced with their aggressive behavior, but Sarah Martinez was not like anyone they had ever encountered. She was an Army Ranger who had sworn an oath to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that oath didn't end just because she was no longer wearing a uniform. Marcus made the first move, lunging towards Sarah with his right hand extended as if to grab her shoulder. His intention was to intimidate her into submission, just as he had done with countless other people who had dared to challenge him. However, Sarah was no ordinary person, and her response was swift and precise. Sarah sidestepped Marcus's clumsy attack with fluid grace, using his own momentum against him. She grabbed his extended arm and twisted it behind his back in a move that sent him stumbling forward into the brick wall. The technique was one she had practiced thousands of times during her military training, and she executed it with the muscle memory of a professional soldier. Tony reacted by charging towards Sarah from her right side, his face red with anger and alcohol. He had never seen anyone handle Marcus so easily, and his pride was wounded. Sarah saw him coming and delivered a precise elbow strike to his solar plexus that knocked the wind out of him and sent him gasping to his knees on the sidewalk. Derek hesitated for a moment, suddenly realizing that this situation was not going according to their plan. He had expected Sarah to be easily intimidated or overwhelmed by their superior numbers. Instead, two of his friends were already neutralized and the woman hadn't even broken a sweat. His hesitation cost him the element of surprise. Sarah turned her attention to Derek, who was still standing several feet away with his mouth hanging open in shock. She didn't want to hurt him unnecessarily, so she simply pointed at him and said, "Stay right where you are." Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who was accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. Marcus pushed himself away from the wall, his expensive polo shirt torn and his face scraped from contact with the rough bricks. He was furious and embarrassed, and his pride demanded that he reassert his dominance. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a switchblade knife, the metal gleaming under the streetlight. Sarah's training immediately shifted into high gear. She had faced knife-wielding opponents before, and she knew that the situation had now become potentially lethal. Her priority was still protecting Jessica, but she also needed to neutralize the immediate threat without causing unnecessary harm to her attackers. The blade changed everything about how she would need to respond. Jessica screamed when she saw the knife, her fear finally overcoming her shock at watching Sarah handle the three men so easily. She pressed herself even harder against the wall, wishing she could disappear entirely. She had never witnessed violence like this, and she couldn't understand how Sarah remained so calm in the face of such danger. Marcus advanced towards Sarah with the knife held in front of him, weaving slightly from the effects of the alcohol he had consumed. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "Now you're going to pay for embarrassing me in front of my friends." He had no idea that threatening someone with a weapon was about to escalate his legal problems far beyond a simple assault charge. Sarah remained perfectly calm, her eyes focused on the knife rather than on Marcus's face. She had been trained to disarm knife-wielding opponents, and she knew that panic or hesitation could be fatal. She also knew that once someone pulled a weapon, the rules of engagement changed completely. She was no longer just trying to de-escalate a confrontation. She was now defending her life and Jessica's safety. Tony was slowly getting back to his feet, still struggling to breathe properly after Sarah's elbow strike. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small pistol, a .22 caliber weapon that his father had given him for protection. The sight of the gun sent a chill down Jessica's spine, but Sarah's expression didn't change at all. Derek finally found his voice and shouted, "Stop this! This has gone too far." He had never intended for anyone to get seriously hurt, and he was beginning to realize that his friends were about to cross a line that could land them all in prison. However, his protests were ignored by Marcus and Tony, who were too angry and too drunk to think clearly about the consequences of their actions. Sarah quickly assessed the new threat level. She now faced one man with a knife and another with a gun, while the third might decide to join the attack at any moment. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple street confrontation, and Sarah knew that she would need to use every skill she had learned during her years of military service to protect herself and Jessica. The next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation ended with everyone walking away safely, or whether it would become a tragedy that would change multiple lives forever. Sarah had faced enemy fighters in Afghanistan who were better trained and more dangerous than these three drunk men, but she had never been forced to use her combat skills on American civilians in her own neighborhood. Sarah's years of combat experience took over as she faced the immediate threat of two weapons. Time seemed to slow down, just as it had during firefights in Afghanistan. She could hear Jessica's frightened breathing behind her and the distant sound of traffic from the main street, but her focus remained entirely on the two armed men in front of her. Marcus lunged forward with the knife, his attack wild and uncontrolled. Sarah moved with the precision of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario countless times. She stepped inside his reach, grabbed his wrist with both hands, and used a leverage technique to force him to drop the weapon. The knife clattered to the sidewalk as Marcus cried out in pain from the pressure applied to his wrist joint. Tony raised his pistol with shaking hands, but his alcohol-impaired coordination made him slow and unsteady. Sarah released Marcus and dove to her left, rolling behind a parked car just as the gun discharged. The bullet sparked off the brick wall where she had been standing moments before, missing Jessica by several feet. The sound of gunfire echoed through the quiet neighborhood like thunder. The gunshot changed everything. What had started as a street confrontation was now an attempted murder, and Sarah knew that Tony had crossed a line that would bring serious legal consequences. She also realized that he was panicking and might fire again without thinking about who else might be in the line of fire. Jessica's safety was now in immediate jeopardy. Derek dropped to the ground and covered his head with his hands, finally understanding that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. He had known Marcus and Tony since childhood, but he had never seen them behave so recklessly. The sound of the gunshot had sobered him instantly, and he began shouting for his friends to stop before someone got killed. Sarah used the parked car as cover while she planned her next move. She could hear Tony cursing and stumbling around on the sidewalk, probably trying to line up another shot. Marcus was moaning and holding his injured wrist, but he was still mobile and potentially dangerous. She needed to neutralize both threats quickly before any innocent bystanders were hurt. Jessica remained frozen against the wall, too terrified to move, even though the gunfire had put her in extreme danger. She watched in amazement as Sarah moved with the fluid grace of a professional athlete, seeming to anticipate every move her attackers would make. The young college student had never imagined that someone could remain so calm and focused in such a chaotic situation. Sirens began wailing in the distance, growing steadily louder as police units responded to reports of gunfire in the downtown area. Someone in a nearby building must have called 911 after hearing the shot. Sarah knew that help was coming, but she also knew that a lot could happen in the few minutes it would take for officers to arrive at the scene. Tony fired a second shot that shattered the rear window of the car Sarah was using for cover. Glass fragments rained down on her, but she remained focused on her tactical situation. She had been under fire many times during her military service, and she knew that panic was the enemy of survival. She needed to end this confrontation before Tony hurt an innocent person. Sarah spotted a broken piece of concrete near her position, probably a chunk that had fallen from the old building's facade. She picked it up and waited for the right moment to act. When Tony stepped around the front of the car to get a better angle for his next shot, Sarah emerged from cover and threw the concrete with deadly accuracy. The improvised projectile struck Tony's gun hand with enough force to break two of his fingers and send the pistol flying across the sidewalk. He screamed in pain and dropped to his knees, clutching his injured hand against his chest. The weapon skittered into a storm drain and disappeared, eliminating the immediate threat to everyone's safety. Marcus tried to retrieve the knife he had dropped earlier, but Sarah was already moving toward him. She tackled him around the waist and drove him backward into the brick wall again, this time with enough force to knock him unconscious. He slumped to the ground and lay still, his expensive clothes now torn and dirty from the confrontation. The police sirens were getting much closer now, and Sarah could see flashing lights reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. She walked over to where Derek was still lying on the ground and told him to stay exactly where he was until the officers arrived. He nodded frantically, having no desire to continue fighting someone who had just defeated his two friends with such devastating efficiency. Sarah then went to Jessica, who was still pressed against the wall but no longer in immediate danger. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, her voice calm and reassuring despite everything that had just happened. Jessica shook her head, unable to speak but clearly grateful that her ordeal was finally over. The young woman had witnessed something that would stay with her for the rest of her life, but she was alive and unharmed thanks to Sarah's intervention. 3 police cars arrived within minutes, their blue and red lights painting the entire street in alternating colors. Officers jumped out with their weapons drawn, shouting commands as they tried to understand what had happened. Sarah immediately raised her hands and identified herself as the person who had called for help. Though she hadn't actually made the call herself, Detective Maria Rodriguez was the first to approach Sarah and Jessica. She was a 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department who had seen countless violent crimes. But something about this scene didn't fit the usual pattern. The 3 men were clearly the aggressors, yet the woman in running clothes appeared completely unharmed and remarkably calm for someone who had just been involved in a gunfight. Jessica found her voice and began explaining to the detective what had happened. She described how the 3 men had cornered her and refused to let her leave, and how Sarah had intervened to help her. Her account was interrupted by sobs as the shock of the situation finally began to set in, but her story was clear and consistent. Derek, still lying on the sidewalk where Sarah had told him to stay, confirmed Jessica's version of events. He was eager to cooperate with the police, hoping that his willingness to testify against his friends might reduce his own legal problems. He explained that Marcus and Tony had been drinking heavily all afternoon and had become increasingly aggressive as the evening progressed. Emergency medical technicians arrived to treat the injured men. Marcus was beginning to regain consciousness but complained of severe pain in his wrist and possible concussion symptoms. Tony's broken fingers required immediate medical attention, and he was transported to the hospital under police guard. Both men would face serious felony charges once they recovered from their injuries. Detective Rodriguez asked Sarah to explain her background and how she had been able to handle 3 attackers, one of whom was armed with a gun. Sarah provided a brief summary of her military service, including her training as an Army Ranger and her combat experience in Afghanistan. The detective was impressed but not entirely surprised, having worked with military veterans throughout her career. Security cameras from nearby businesses had captured most of the confrontation, providing clear evidence of who had been the aggressor in each phase of the incident. The footage showed Sarah acting purely in self-defense and in defense of Jessica, using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize each threat as it emerged. The video evidence would be crucial in any legal proceedings that followed. Sarah learned that Marcus Webb was the son of a prominent businessman who owned several car dealerships throughout the Phoenix area. Tony Chen was the nephew of a city councilman and had 2 previous arrests for assault that had been quietly dismissed through his family's political connections. Derek Martinez came from a wealthy family of real estate developers who had significant influence in local politics. Detective Rodriguez explained that this case would likely receive significant media attention because of the families involved and the dramatic nature of the confrontation. She warned Sarah that the 3 men's lawyers would probably try to portray her as the aggressor, despite the clear evidence to the contrary. The detective had seen wealthy defendants attempt to flip the narrative in similar cases before. Local news crews began arriving at the scene within an hour, having monitored police radio frequencies for breaking stories. Sarah declined to give interviews, following advice from Detective Rodriguez to let the evidence speak for itself. However, several witnesses from nearby businesses spoke to reporters and described what they had seen of the confrontation. Jessica's parents arrived at the scene after receiving a frantic phone call from their daughter. They were horrified to learn how close she had come to serious harm, but they were also deeply grateful to Sarah for her intervention. Jessica's father, a prominent surgeon at a local hospital, promised to do everything in his power to support Sarah if she faced any legal challenges. The investigation continued for several hours as police collected evidence and interviewed witnesses. Sarah was asked to come to the police station the following day to give a formal statement, but she was not arrested or charged with any crime. Detective Rodriguez made it clear that Sarah's actions appeared to be completely justified under Arizona's self-defense laws. As the scene was finally cleared and the police cars departed, Sarah realized that her quiet evening jog had turned into something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She had simply done what her training and her conscience had told her to do, but she was about to discover that standing up to wealthy and connected bullies came with consequences she hadn't anticipated. The 3 men's families had significant resources and political connections that they would use to try to protect their sons from the consequences of their actions. They had successfully covered up previous incidents involving their children, and they had no intention of allowing this confrontation to result in serious criminal charges. Sarah Martinez, the Army Ranger who had simply tried to help an innocent young woman, was about to find herself in the fight of her life. The media coverage of the confrontation exploded across social platforms within hours of the incident. Video footage from security cameras had been leaked to local news stations, showing Sarah's precise and controlled response to the 3 attackers. The story of an Army Ranger defending an innocent college student against wealthy bullies captured public attention immediately. However, the families of Marcus, Tony, and Derek quickly mobilized their considerable resources to control the narrative. High-powered attorneys appeared on morning talk shows, suggesting that Sarah had used excessive force and that their clients were the real victims. They painted a picture of a trained killer who had attacked 3 innocent young men who were simply trying to help a lost college student. Sarah received a call from Jessica's father, Dr. Chen, who informed her that the 3 families were pressuring the district attorney's office to file charges against her. Despite the clear evidence of self-defense, the political connections of the accused men's families were creating pressure to prosecute Sarah for assault and battery. The message was clear. Challenging the wealthy and connected came with serious consequences. Local veterans organizations rallied to Sarah's defense after learning about her military background and the circumstances of the confrontation. The veterans of foreign wars and the American Legion both issued statements supporting her actions and demanding that the district attorney focus on prosecuting the actual criminals rather than their victim. Military veterans throughout the state began organizing to show their support. The break in the case came when Detective Rodriguez discovered that the three men had been involved in similar incidents before, but their families had successfully covered them up. A pattern emerged of young women being harassed, intimidated, and in some cases assaulted by the trio, with victims being paid to remain silent or intimidated into not pressing charges. Sarah's military records were subpoenaed by the defense attorneys, who hoped to find evidence that she had psychological problems or violent tendencies that would support their case. Instead, they discovered an exemplary service record filled with commendations for bravery and leadership. Her commanding officers testified that she had always shown remarkable restraint and judgment, even in the most dangerous combat situations. The security footage became the turning point in public opinion. When the complete video was released, it clearly showed Marcus, Tony, and Derek surrounding and threatening Jessica before Sarah intervened. The footage also showed Marcus drawing the knife and Tony firing his weapon first, proving that Sarah had acted purely in self-defense throughout the confrontation. Jessica Chen became a powerful advocate for Sarah, giving emotional interviews about how her life had been saved by the veterans' intervention. She described the terror she had felt when the three men cornered her, and her gratitude for Sarah's courage in stepping in to help a complete stranger. Her testimony contradicted every claim made by the defense attorneys. The district attorney, facing overwhelming public pressure and clear evidence of the three men's guilt, announced that no charges would be filed against Sarah Martinez. Instead, Marcus Webb was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Tony Chen was charged with attempted murder for firing his gun, and Derek Martinez was charged as an accessory to both crimes. The three families' attempts to use their wealth and connections to escape justice had backfired spectacularly. Their heavy-handed legal tactics and victim-blaming strategy had drawn national attention to their son's crimes and their own attempts to cover them up. Federal investigators began looking into previous incidents that had been quietly settled, opening up new legal problems for all three families. Sarah returned to her normal routine of working at the gym and attending college classes, but her life had been permanently changed by the confrontation. She received job offers from private security companies and invitations to speak at military veteran events. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her military training and values remained relevant in civilian life. The three men were eventually convicted and sentenced to significant prison terms. Marcus received 5 years for assault with a deadly weapon, Tony received 8 years for attempted murder, and Derek received 3 years as an accessory. Their appeals were unsuccessful, and their families' political connections proved worthless in the face of overwhelming evidence and public scrutiny. Sarah established a non-profit organization to provide self-defense training for young women, using her military expertise to teach others how to protect themselves. Jessica Chen became her first volunteer instructor after completing an intensive training program. The organization grew rapidly as women throughout the state sought to learn the skills that had saved Jessica's life. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that wealth and connections could protect someone from the consequences of their actions. It also became an inspiring story about ordinary people having the courage to do the right thing, even when facing overwhelming odds. Sarah Martinez had picked the right fight with the wrong people, and justice had ultimately prevailed through her courage and determination.